Okay, you guys mind if I'm gonna take the lights off here? All right, so we started this last class. We didn't get very far, so I'm just gonna touch on a few of the things we talked early on about, and then we'll wrap up today with a cliff. So we got the start of lesson 2 here, the Slave South and the early abolitionist movement. This painting is folk art. This is the ball stick dance or the stick dance that would have been performed. We have a banjo here, which was an African instrument that was used in a lot of folk music, still is used in a lot of folk music, especially in Appalachia. And this particular painting is entitled The Old Plantation. Pretty famous piece of art from the Library of Congress. And the depiction is from Beaufort, South Carolina. All right, so we talked a bit about the planter aristocracy. Only about 12% of the antebellum Southern population were considered planters, meaning they owned 20 or more slaves. And as we talked about in lesson 1, less than 5% would have owned over 100 slaves. A lot of these aristocrats gained their wealth and land by birth over generations. I think I talked a little bit about those land grants that dated back to the colonial period. This is handed down over time. These are the most well-connected. They are the most politically connected. They are the most well-educated. Some of them are sent to northern Ivy League schools. Some of them are sent to southern colleges. Keep in mind, at this period of time, state colleges are real. This is early on for state colleges in the American South. The earliest state colleges in the American South: University of North Carolina, University of Georgia, University of Virginia. Do you have any Tar Heels, Cavaliers, or Dogs out there? All right, cool. Also, my alma mater, Virginia Military Institute, oldest state military college, founded in 1839. So these are those planters are typically educated either in Europe or educated in the North. Some of them may have attended William and Mary, which would have been the oldest college in the American South. I talked a little bit about Ivanhoe last class. Did you all ever read any Sir Walter Scott in either Brit Lit or American Lit? Okay. This is the idea that they took on this sort of story as a sort of a moral justification that they were doing right by the South by keeping them safe and keeping them keeping them fed. The idea that whether they were slaves or whether they were free African Americans or whether they were poor whites, the aristocracy had a job to do. They had to keep the economy going. They had to keep the political structure in place, and that all of their subjects were just feudal subjects. I talked a bit about the Southern plantation system for women. Mistresses ran the plantations. They were in charge of everything from the day-to-day operation of a plantation and the plantation house. They were surrounded by a team of servants. This also created a class structure within the slave system, meaning that if you were a higher upper class slave in the slave system, you would have been working in the house and you would have been working for the mistress. You also are in a very bizarre and complex relationship where you need to be trusted by her and she needs to be trusted by you, but it's a very weird dance that they have to perform because neither group trusted one another. Even though many mistresses saw the group of slaves that worked for them as their family, there was also at any given time, this group of people could be dismissed from the house and sold to another plantation or sold deep into the deeper south, also known as downriver. Some mistresses treated their slaves in the house and out of the house with a great deal of dignity. In fact, most mistresses were given the job of providing health care for their slaves and providing, taking care of ailing slaves. But a number of mistresses were quite brutal. And regardless, any mistress at this period of time owned their slaves as property. So there was a disconnect. There had to have been a disconnect between that relationship. Another thing that caused a great deal of strife in the homes is the fact that not all masters were faithful to their wives, and many mistresses' children and children of slaves would have bared the same likeness. And in some cases, they actually admitted that they were siblings. So that created a level of distrust and some really strained relations for slaves. And most of these relationships were not consensual. There were some that were consensual, but a lot of them weren't. Not always was a child of mixed race, which would have been considered by the census at this period of time, a mulatto, the child of a master. Could be child of an overseer, could be child of other people in and out of the plantation. That was common. Most of the time, those relationships were not consensual, but sometimes they were. And there are diaries that have been, and a number of different accounts that have been written about this. In your text, Mary Chestnut, the lady that wrote one of the most famous Civil War diaries, she talks about the interesting dynamic of this in her diary. The dynamic of sibling children living two different lives on the plantation. I talked a little bit about Oak Alley Plantation in Louisiana. You guys remember what Oak Alley produced? Good job, sugar. It was a big-time sugar plantation. So the reason I pulled Oak Alley up is I wanted to just highlight the fact that in the antebellum era and the pre-Civil War era, you're still seeing production of corn and rice and indigo and tobacco as profitable crops, but more money is now being made off cotton and sugar. Those become the big money makers, and that's it's on the Mississippi. It's like north of New Orleans and northeast of Baton Rouge. Oak Alley, yeah. I have not, but I thought this was a good one to pull. All right, so remember that the majority of slaves at this period of time are working on farms, whether they are large plantations or small farms. The typical slave owner owned somewhere between 5 to 12 slaves. Okay, it was rare to see, these massive, large, aristocratic plantations producing a lot of cotton. What you typically see is, like same for sugar and cotton, mass plantations producing their cotton, but they're also ginning the cotton, and they're baling the cotton, and they're selling the cotton. So all these farmers in the region are going to grow their own have a small force of slaves, and then they'll sell those crops to the larger plantation to have it produced and sold. Another reason that cotton becomes extremely profitable, it will rot, but it has a period that it can sit. It's much longer than corn or tobacco or rice, and it's also less expensive to grow. The irony of the cotton industry at this period of time is that it wasn't really learned about or grown on a large scale until people noticed that slaves were growing it in their own gardens. And then they started to grow it, and the cotton gin comes into the game, and it becomes the most profitable crop from the 1830s into the 1850s for the American South. Yeah, what's up? So slaves typically had their own gardens. They had to sustain their own. They were, they had to be subsistence farmers as well. Even though most slaves worked from dusk till dawn, they were typically given time to cultivate their own crops because it made more sense for them to grow their own crops on a plantation as opposed to the plantation owner providing food for all their slaves. There were plantations that did have sort of like a meal system where slaves received their food, but a lot of them, did their own. They grew their own crops, like small gardens. So the reason that they grew their own cotton is because they were taking that cotton, they were producing their own thread, and then they were producing their own clothes. And slave owners started to see that take place and realized, hey, we can grow cotton on a large scale and not have to worry about buying finished goods from England. So this I'm talking about is during the colonial period that took place. Does that make sense? Right. Because that's why you don't see cotton on a large scale in that early colonial period. I think we discussed that last year. All right, so again, the farming economy monopolized not only the agricultural economy monopolized the South, and it was directly tied into the slave labor. That also leads to, after the introduction of the cotton gin, an increase in the price of slaves. So as slavery goes on a decline in the northern slave states, the price of slaves goes up in the Deep South as more and more land is acquired to grow cotton. That is why slave markets in places like Richmond are going to sell slaves south. Cotton becomes the king crop in the Deep South. And again, we talked about this last class. Northerners are getting wealthy off this because you have textile mills popping up like Slater's Mill in Pawtucket, Lowell Mill in Massachusetts, among others, throughout the North. Keep in mind, though, and I thought we brought up a really good point about the bank war earlier, keep in mind that the tariff issue is one that divides North and South, and slavery is intertwined, guys, with that. And the reason for it is that there is not going to, the South is not going to be interested in paying a high tax on imported goods. The South does not care about buying American goods. There is no loyalty to buying a northern produced product like a chair in Massachusetts versus a chair produced in Essex or Edinburgh or wherever in England or in Europe. Okay? They need to move their goods to market. They're not worried about where their goods come from. They want to be able to have an open line of trade. Another part of this that I think you guys need to understand is the South, when we talked about the colonial economy, they feel like they are the ones that are being handcuffed economically because the tariff protects the northern industry, but there is nothing in place to protect southern agriculture. So that becomes a disconnect as well. Again, even its greatest defenders, like the South's greatest defenders of the tariff and of slavery, John C. Calhoun, cannot deny that there is a connection between the tariff and the slave system. Okay? Do you guys have any questions here? All right. So let's just take a look at this. On the top left, we've already looked at this image, slaves picking cotton. The bottom left, we have the cotton gin. But this is just a quick map of the production of growth in cotton, the population growth in cotton production from 1821 to 1859. This right here is what we would consider the antebellum era, that pre-Civil War era. This is the era in which cotton becomes king. And you can see here what is known as the Black Belt is where the majority of your cotton is being grown. And you do have some cotton grown here in southern Virginia, like southeastern Virginia, like Southampton County, Virginia produced cotton, they still do today. But the most of your cotton production is going to be in the deep south. All right, so let's talk a bit about free African Americans. Free African Americans are going to gain freedom through a handful of ways. They're either the descendants of indentured servants. For the first 50 years in colonial America, Africans were not slaves. They were indentured servants who lived, on a plantation or on a farm. They worked for like 7-10 years, however long their contract was for, and then they gained their freedom. Typically those farms were tobacco farms, and then as their children were born into the world, they are born free. Okay? There's another group that is free as well. They are those who fought in the American Revolution. But it's super lopsided. Like 5,000 former slaves fought on the side of the Continental Army, and like 30,000 served for the British. So those who served for the British will end up in Canada or end up in England or other parts of the world. Those who served for and some actually wound up back in America, but I don't have time to really get into that. There are some cases of that. But of those 5,000, those individuals became free, and then their children became free. So of that group that I just mentioned, those who lived in indentured servitude and those who served in the Revolution, that is a small number. So the majority of those who genuinely gained their freedom either bought their freedom or were freed by their masters upon their master's death. That is the largest population. The number of free African Americans at the start of the war, the Civil War, is somewhere between 250,000 and 260,000, somewhere in that neighborhood. Okay? The majority of those folks lived in urban centers, and the largest number of those free African Americans lived in the Upper South in places like Richmond, Virginia. So, are we familiar with the Jackson Ward area of Richmond? Not familiar with that in the city? They just erected the Maggie Walker statue over there. Those are like some of the earlier free black communities in America. Okay, that's an example of one. So, what do free African Americans do? They're artisans, they're carpenters, they're barbers. They're hired out to industrial factories like in Richmond, Tredegar Iron Works. The problem, though, is that they are stuck. They don't have a lot of rights. They rarely could vote. There's only a handful of cases in a handful of states and localities could free African Americans vote. They surely could not vote in the South. They could not testify in most states. They could not receive a fair trial in nearly any state. And there's an individual who was trying to change the laws on that. You're all familiar with George Wythe, the famous law professor, taught Thomas Jefferson. He was trying to change that law. It didn't come to fruition in Virginia. An ironic story about George Wythe. I taught you guys last year, those of you that I didn't have. Wythe was poisoned by his nephew, and the only witness to the death was George Wyth's house slave, who was also his concubine. And she could not testify on his behalf, the very law that Wyth was trying to change. Yeah. That was Michelle asked a really good question. This was done in one of two ways. Like Henry the Box Brown, for example, he was a skilled artisan who bought his family's freedom, but there were some men who would buy their own freedom and have enough, they would have enough money to buy their wife and children, and then when they bought their wife and children, they owned them, but in reality, they were free.
No, I meant more like in the slave masters who have children with their slaves, and then they have that child be their slave. Like, how morally does that work?
I couldn't imagine. It's crazy, but it happened all the time. Frederick Douglass was the son of his master. Another example, though, is that not just a handful, not a large number of slaves actually owned slaves, but that was typically in, like, more in the Deep South. There was an area in Natchez, Mississippi, that occurred, but that was more of a rare occurrence. Let's see. One thing I want to talk about: free African Americans. I just discussed in the South. Free African Americans in the North also faced a great deal of adversity. Most moved to urban centers. There is a large free African American community in Philadelphia, New York, Rochester, New York. Rochester kind of becomes the hub of the abolitionist movement. That's where Frederick Douglass will set up shop, among others. But a lot of free African Americans, they have the right to own land, they have the right to have contracts, and in some cases they do get the franchise, the right to vote in the North. But most are not treated fairly, and there is a deep hatred by lower class whites, especially immigrants coming over from Ireland, very good, Gavin, and coming to a degree coming over from Germany, because that's where we see our largest waves of immigrants coming over at this time. But as you just stated, the biggest clash is going to be between the Irish and African Americans. We see riots going on in the streets between African Americans and immigrants and nativists in cities like Philadelphia, New York. I mean, anybody ever seen Gangs in New York? All right, heard of that film? Pack a lunch. It's 3 hours, but it is a awesome film, and it's based on the nativists, the know-nothings, and their battle against the Dead Rabbits, the Irish gang. But one thing that they only highlighted at the end was the New York City race riots that were occurring during the Civil War. I think they should have highlighted, Scorsese is like one of the greatest directors of all time, but there should have been more of a highlight on the race tension that was going on in there in the 5 points. 5 points as well, right? Good point. No pun intended. All right, so Tocqueville. Did anybody read any excerpts from Democracy in America last year? Well, you guys did. Bunch of you did. Did you guys read it okay, so you didn't check that out. Okay, so Tocqueville is coming over from France, and he writes a memoir about his experience in America in the antebellum America. All right, and what he talks about here is, in this particular statement, is that he feels like the race tensions are just as bad, if not worse, in the North than they are in the South. He also writes about how when he travels along the Ohio River, you go on one side of the Ohio and it's like a different world than the other. Because that Ohio River, on the one side, is places like Cincinnati, which was like the leading meatpacking industry at that period of time. It was before Chicago got big, and it was an industrial producer, and it was producing guns and all this other stuff, and it was a hustling, bustling town, or not town, but metropolitan area, an urban area. Whereas you cross the river to Kentucky, you can see across the river slaves toiling in the fields, in large plantations, okay? All right, so there's a great deal of racism against free African Americans throughout. Pulled this, thought this was kind of a cool little local connection here. This is a barbershop in Richmond in 1861, so this is at the start of the Civil War. This particular image is at the Valentine Museum down in the city. Pretty cool. Another interesting thing that I wanted to bring up too in Richmond, there's a very interesting profession that free African Americans got involved in. How many people would like to go into medicine? Anybody want to go into medicine? Maybe? Okay. Virginia was kind of like on the cutting edge of this period of time for the medical profession. There's a guy by the name of Dr. McGuire that establishes one of the early medical colleges in the United States. It's called the Medical College of Virginia. So, are we all familiar with MCV, which VCU now owns? Another early medical place, well, not medical college, but medical curriculum that was provided was at the University of Virginia. What does a medical college need for its students? Very good. They need cadavers. So a lot of free African Americans in the Richmond area made a decent profit on grave robbing because MCV needed cadavers.
That's a weird thing.
There was a demand. So which it was. This is a moral conflict.
But without permission, you were technically.
They were getting it for sure without permission. So
you have consent from the family, sure.
You did not.
But
Not in
I
this
did
case.
So, it's just morally wrong and disgusting.
That's a tough nut to crack right there. So we have again the slave importation. Transatlantic slave importation was banned in 1808. This does not, again, it's not in the Constitution, but it is banned, and it becomes, let's call it frowned upon because it continued, and most people were not tried nor executed. I'm going to share an article with you guys about a transatlantic slave trader that was tried and executed during this era. The slave population in the American South from 1800 doubled every 20 years, and in 1860, the slave population was at about 4 million. So between slave population and free African American population, you're looking at about 4.2, 4.25. Again, the Deep South counties, most of the Deep South counties, African American slaves outnumbered white inhabitants. In the state of South Carolina, the entire state, African American slaves outnumbered white inhabitants. In Virginia, it was like less counties, more along the Tidewater. One in particular would be Southampton County. Southampton County, Virginia, was the second largest slaveholding county in the country at the start of the American Civil War. What this is going to do is it's going to inspire works by a number of different authors. You've got Theodore Dwight Weld, who's an abolitionist, who wrote Slavery as It Is. He inspires Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Solomon Northup, his memoir, 12 Years a Slave. Has anybody seen the film, 12 Years a Slave? Did I already ask you that? It's a pretty gripping film, and you guys will do a personal film review this semester, and that would be one you could choose from. He talks about, he was a free African-American, educated carpenter, musician, and he'll be captured, sold into slavery in the Deep South. So Uncle Tom's Cabin was, again, a bestseller. It is a novel, but the stories are very real. And a lot of the stories that Harriet Beecher Stowe pulls are going to be excerpts and stories from Theodore Dwight Wells' Slavery as It Is. Solomon Northup, his is actually a memoir narrative, or a memoir autobiography of his experience. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1852. Upon meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe, Abraham Lincoln will famously say, this is debated historically, "You are the little woman who started the Great War." All right, so life under slavery, very difficult. It typically was work from dusk till dawn. There were situations, though, where there was what is called, what was referred to as task labor. So you were given a certain group of tasks, you completed those tasks, and then the rest of the time was yours. But by the time, if you saw slavery on a large plantation, those slaves were working dusk till dawn and typically had Sundays off. And that involved church services. Most church services were either the sermons were given by the plantation owner, the local preacher. In some cases, African Americans were allowed to preach to their congregation, but that all changed after the Nat Turner Rebellion. We'll talk a little bit about that here shortly. There were laws that were passed to try to protect slaves, but most of those were ignored. A good example of that would be there were laws against breeding slaves, but that was common, meaning that if a woman had more than 10 children in some cases, she would be set free. But that meant that she was separated from her family. That was the worst horror that slaves had to deal with among everything else that they were enduring. Like the beatings, the constant fear of potentially being worked to death, starved to death, or killed in some fashion, was coupled with the fear of being sold downriver or sold to the Deep South. There is a period of time in which people consciously try to keep slave families together, but that typically ends when a master dies and those slaves are not freed upon his death. If they are not freed upon his death and they become property of another family member, say a son or a mistress or a daughter, typically that family is broken up. Another reason that this caused a problem is as tobacco goes into a glut market and as there's a decline in the want and need for slavery in the northern southern states, a lot of these slave families are being broken apart. Slave marriages were not recognized. Most slave children were named after their master's surname. And typically when slaves were taught how to, if they were taught any sort of biblical sermons or preached to, they were preached to with selected passages. to try to make that system of slavery to reinforce the paternal system of slavery. All right, so we're at burdens of bondage. I'm going to pump the brakes here. Did you guys have any questions before we wrapped up? All right, cool. So let's